secret of the family tomb. There is more to life than meets the eye. A cemetery's caretaker was left confused when a family tomb he cleaned just the day before was a mess the next morning. Certain that no one had visited the tomb in the period he wasn't around, he began digging around for answers. What he found left him utterly surprised. Today, your challenge is to separate what is true from what is false. 5 stories, some real, some fake. You'll be told about a family tomb's secret, a strange visitor from the past, a prayer by the dead, help from above, and the power of a mother's kiss. Can you judge which are fact and which are fiction? Brace yourself for a journey into the unknown, a journey to be revealed. Let's start with the first story, the secret of the family tomb. Mr. Jim Carson had been working at the Riverdale Cemetery for close to 15 years, but never had he experienced anything as strange as what happened on this particular day. A young woman named Mrs. Smith had just died, and her family came to bury her in their family's tomb. Just a week before, the family also buried their daughter, Laura, in the same tomb. She was reportedly a troubled teenager who had met her death after running away from home. Some say it was the loss of her daughter that led to her death, but there's no conclusive evidence in that regard. After Mrs. Smith's funeral, Mr. Carson came to clean up the tomb and made sure everything was in order before he left for home. However, the next morning, he found out that the tomb had been trashed. Disturbed by this occurrence, he called on the police to help investigate because there was no sign of forced entry could have done something of that sort. The detective came up with different theories, but nothing conclusive was reached. So, the caretaker was encouraged to clean up the tomb again with the idea that he must have been mistaken. But just a few hours later, the tomb was a mess again. The detective and caretaker couldn't believe their eyes. They searched high and low for clues, but found nothing. So the detective came up with a plan. He asked the caretaker to clean again and poured sand on the floor so that the vandal would leave footprints in it. The next morning, the tomb was in fact desecrated again, and this time, there was the phrase, "Not here," written on the wall, but there were no footprints in the sand. Everyone was confused, but the priest who had conducted Laura's funeral soon visited the police. He told him that Laura's father recently discovered from her diary that she had been abused by her mother, and that the desecration of the tomb might be Laura protest her mom's presence there. The theory didn't make sense to the detective, but since nothing else did, they decided to move Mrs. Smith's body from the family tomb. Lo and behold, the trashing stopped, which means the daughter had just been crying for help, despite being dead. Do you think this could have happened? Let's move on to the second story, a visitor from the past. Diane and her grandmother had a relationship no one else understood. She spent all of her free time with her, listening to stories of her youth and playing games with her. At first, no one minded because the grandmother needed company after losing her husband before Diane was born. But her parents soon grew concerned when it became clear that they were excessively attached to each other. However, they could do nothing about it. One night, Diane and her grandma were having their usual lengthy conversations when her grandma suddenly stopped talking. At first, Diane assumed that she had fallen asleep, but when she turned to look at her, she was wide awake and was staring directly at the window with an unblinking stare. The young girl tried to ask her grandmother what was wrong, but the old woman shushed her and continued staring in that direction. Then, after a while, she started talking to whatever she was seeing at the window. Young Diane grew more concerned and asked whom she was talking to. This time, the old woman replied and said, "Look, can't you see your grandfather at the window?" Diane was so terrified because she couldn't see anyone at the window. Suddenly, her grandmother shouted, "No, I want to live some more years before you come to me, though I really miss you." After a while, she turned to Diane and said, "He's gone." Seeing the confused look on her granddaughter's face, she further explained that her husband had come through the iron-barred window and asked how she was faring. Then he asked her if she was willing to go with him or wait a few more years, to which she responded she needed about 8 more years to spend with Diane. Young Diane secretly thought her grandmother was losing her mind. However, exactly 8 years later, the old woman died. And this got Diane wondering if the old woman had been speaking the truth after all. That is very strange, right? Do you believe this actually happened? The third story is the accident. In the 1950s, there was a Mexican family who usually left America for their home in Mexico for the holidays. On one of such visits, they encountered a strange accident. The father, his cousin who was driving, and 2 young sons were headed to their home via a dirt highway in Old Mexico. Everything was going fine until their car was struck by another car whose driver had been drinking. The impact immediately sent their car over the edge of the cliff, and it led to the instant death of the father, the cousin, and a son, while the other son was terribly injured, whose name was Jose, was in and out of consciousness for 2 days before he was finally found by a passerby who rushed him to a hospital. Since the hospital was in Old Mexico and had limited facilities, everyone was certain he was going to die. But he woke up, saw his mom, and asked after his family. Due to his poor health, they told him they were fine but were receiving treatment in separate rooms and should focus on getting better. As he was recuperating, he began to get more curious about the whereabouts of the others. But they convinced him that the others were also bedridden, and that's why they couldn't visit. One morning, Jose woke up in a startle and asked for his brother Ernesto. His mother was ready with her usual excuses when he said, "Where did Ernesto go? He was here with me last night. I woke up and he was kneeling here on the side of the bed praying, and he stayed till I was back asleep. Go get him. I want to see him." His poor mother was startled because Ernesto was dead, so she was forced to tell him about the death of the others. He couldn't believe it and swore that he saw his brother and not just imagined his presence, but his mother convinced him of his death. Everyone who heard the story categorized it as symptoms of drug-induced delirium. However, it could have happened. Or don't you think so? In the fourth story, we learn about the candle. The Rodrigos had a tradition of honoring their dead by lighting candles around the house every other week to help them find their way back anytime they needed to visit. The tradition went back many generations, and most family members just did it anyway, not because they believed they could communicate with the dead. However, what happened to Freya changed the whole narrative. Freya was one of the youngest daughters of Matthew Rodrigo. Her father had died just 2 years back, and his death hit her the most because they were extremely close. She often held on to some of his clothes whenever she missed him just to inhale his scent. Although his scent was already fading, she fought to have it engraved in her memory. It's no surprise that she took the candle lighting seriously because she wanted him to come visit. She even once complained about not lighting the candles every day with the excuse that her father might get lost in the dark if he decides to visit in the week that the candles are not lit. Her siblings teased her for believing, but she didn't mind. Once a week, when the candle was lit, Freya felt her father's presence for the first time. She had heard him come in through her bedroom window and perceived his scent as he moved closer to her. She sat in bed and felt his presence next to her, and she began telling him about how much she missed him. He seemed to hear as she felt him rustling her hair. Afraid she was dreaming, she tried to stay in the moment as long as she could. However, she soon fell asleep. When she woke up, she almost concluded it was a dream when she saw a picture that she had tucked away after his death right next to her. It was a picture of him giving her a hug. She couldn't tell anyone, but she didn't need to because he returned and this time made his presence known to all. That day, Freya had spent her day gardening as she normally would to keep herself preoccupied. Unknown to her, a scorpion had gotten into her gardening gloves when she took it off to wash her hands outside. She had then taken the gardening gloves inside, thereby mistakenly taking in the scorpion. Later that night, she was walking down the hallway to get something from the kitchen when the candle suddenly lit up, which caused her to see the scorpion that was about to sting her. Luckily, at just that moment, one of her sisters was coming from the kitchen, so she witnessed the sudden lighting of the candle. And just like Freya, she also perceived her father's scent. Both sisters hurried to tell what just happened to the family because it was the week they didn't light the candles. When they got to the hallway, they found the candles lit and perceived their father's lingering scent. From that day, the candles in the home of the Rodrigos were always lit because who knew which of their relatives might want to visit? Intriguing, right? But is this occurrence a possibility? The fifth and final story, a mother's kiss. Georgia's life completely changed when her mother was diagnosed with cancer. Although she was very young, she knew that something was amiss. Her mom couldn't help her make the peanut butter and jelly sandwich she loved, or help her brush her hair before she goes to school. However, the only thing that remained unchanged was her mother kissing her every night before she went to bed. Even on the night she had to go to the hospital, she made sure to kiss her before leaving. But one day, her mother couldn't kiss her because she died. But young Georgia was only very worried that she would go no longer being kissed goodnight. She wailed about it, and her dad tried to make up for it, but it just wasn't the same. However, one night, while crying herself to sleep, she felt something cold on her forehead. When she thought she imagined it, she then felt it on her right cheek and then her left, just like her mom used to kiss her. She slept peacefully for the first time since her mother's death that night. But when she woke up, she felt sad again. The next night, she waited in anticipation for her mother's kiss. It didn't come. But just as she was falling asleep, she felt it. From that night and several nights after, Georgia felt her mother's kiss just as she was about to fall asleep. Now let's reveal which of the stories are fact and which are fiction. Could you tell them apart? What do you think about the rift between Laura and her mom, even in death? Do you think a ghost could protest the presence of another corpse in her tomb? Well, you might think it's fiction, but this story happens to be true. How about the story of the visitor from the past? That of the grandmother who begged her husband not to take her yet. If you're familiar with stories of paranormal activities, then you might guess that this is indeed a fact. Diane's grandmother begged her husband, who had come to take her with him, to stay for a few more years. Similarly, Jose also saw Ernesto praying for him in the story about the accident. Now, we don't know if he imagined it or not. What do you think? However, based on findings, it's a true story. In the story of the candle, you might find the bond between Freya and her father quite charming. But no candle was lit to help save her from a scorpion sting. This story is completely fictional. In the final story about a mother's kiss, you know the one about Georgia who got kissed by her mother every night, even after death? Well, it's pure fiction. There's nothing true about the story. A girl somewhere named Georgia might have lost her mother to cancer, but we know nothing of her or her mother's kiss.